So I think there's a little aftermath you can do using interpersonal skills, but beforehand, it's that inquisitive person that's talking with everybody and generally cares what's going on with everybody's department. You're probably going to get a lot.
Welcome in, everybody. You're listening to Wrestling Payments, a podcast where we help payment professionals contend with the challenges of modernizing their payments operations and identifying ways to build for the future. If you're interested in payments innovation and modernization, you're in the right place. Now, let's get into it.
Hi, and welcome to Wrestling Payments, a podcast of Neach, by Neach. Today, especially by Neach, because we have a guest today who's a very popular guest, is Sean Carter. Sean, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sean Carter, President and CEO of Neach and Neach Payments Group. I'm excited to once again join Wrestling Payments for a really interesting conversation with you, Joe.
I do think it's going to be an interesting conversation, and that's what it is. It is a conversation. We're teeing it up. We're hoping that the conversation will continue, whether it's in Members Corner, LinkedIn, in some comments on the podcast themselves. We really want to hear what your thoughts are around this. And it is about risk management and payments. I've been around for a while, and we've seen risk management grow and change and evolve. And I'm sure Sean has some opinions, but I recently attended a risk retreat with NACHA. And, I thought I knew risk, but these folks introduced me to some new concepts. So the first thing I do when I get a new concept is I research it and I study it and I get some resources. So I've been looking at ERM, which is enterprise risk management, and SRM, which is strategic risk management, as topics. Sean, I think, I've heard you for years talk about those. What, when I say ERM and SRM, what are the first things that come to your mind?
For me, ERM, when I think about ERM, I think of teams, right? And because that's really the intent of enterprise risk management, is that everybody from every department has a role to play in ensuring that the strategic objectives, whatever we're trying to do, get done without creating much harm to the organization, right? That's how I've always looked at enterprise ERM. When I think of strategic risk management, I haven't always tied those things together as easily, but now that we're talking about all the innovations in payments over the last couple of years, right? There really is that need to think about these things as you're developing your strategy. You have to understand, the risk to the organization, right? Starting with to not do or do, right? But beyond that, there's so much to that, including risk management in your strategy thoughts. I know, I've talked about this for Neach, right? And trying to think about where do we take Neach, and we have to include some of that in our own thought process. So I think to me, that to me is something over the last probably 4 years that I've really thought about. ERM, I've always kind of tied it with what we do here, but SRM to me is more of a, hey, that could have used it too a couple of years, when I first started leading the organization, probably not as good as I should have been, right? And so I think that's an interesting one. And when you tie it to payments, of course, which is what Neach is in, it is time for that, right? So you really need to find, our members need to really think through these decisions with a lens on that. Hey, what could happen to the organization, good or bad, right? It's not about just the bad, too. You have to plan for the overwhelmingly good as well.
So we've got a couple of speaking notes here, but I do hate talking about a topic just after I've listened to books or read a book, and it's because I don't want to come off as, oh, well, the book says, but the book says, and it gave examples. The big examples it gave right off the bat was Disney, right? Disney back in the 60s. Walt Disney had led the company to be a cartoon or a a story company where they sold Disney stories on movies, and they built a park out in California. And right at the end of his life, he had switched his vision to Florida and acquiring a ton of land in Florida. And after he passed away, they just kept developing that land, which is fine. Great idea. Got a little trouble now, but we're not that kind of podcast. But the thing that happened with them is, when you think about the strategy and the strategic risk for that, it is a risk, according to the book, that would cause the business to cease. So they went from a movie company to a real estate company, because they were just acquiring land and holding land and sitting on land. They weren't producing any movies. They weren't producing anything new. So the strategic risk there for them was they no longer were in the business they thought they were in. They had to make some changes and adjustments and the like. So for me, strategic management is, if it will cause your company, your bank, your credit union, your insurance company, your fintech to cease operating, it is a strategic risk. So we talked about Rumsfeld, and I know you pushed back on me and said there's no way Rumsfeld was in a strategy book. But after I brought up the quote, do you want to talk about what we talked about with knowns and unknowns?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. So when you dig into the knowns and unknowns context around, as Rumsfeld was saying, when you tie that to payments, there really is a lot in each bucket, right? There's things you absolutely know about a payment system from a risk standpoint, right? There's things you absolutely know about your customers from a risk standpoint. There's a lot of things you don't know about your customers. There's a lot of things you think you know about a payment system that you might know. And then there's a lot of things you don't know how your customers and that payment system would interact. So, at first my pause was, were they mocking him by attributing that quote about the knowns and the unknowns? But it's actually something he said, and it makes perfect sense in almost anything you want to apply it to. But let's keep it to within payments. Mm-hmm. I always look at customer and the offerings, right? And there's a lot of known in all of that, but there's also a lot of unknown. And then you step back and you look at your own employees as an organization, and then there's things you may not know that you don't know, right? Because they haven't been exposed to it, which obviously becomes a challenge for management making decisions, right? Because you almost kind of blinders in some spots, because nobody thought to say that this could be an issue because they didn't know it. So I found that really interesting. I thought we were going somewhere else with that when you first brought it to me, but we looked it up, and it was a legit, not mocking him or getting into anything that this podcast doesn't touch. But I really find that interesting, and if you combine it, in our world, it makes so much sense. And when we talk to members, Joe, right, I just dealt with a call this morning that they had a product, they use the product, their members are using the product, they set some very high level controls that seemed to be working, and they had an employee that didn't follow procedure, right, and the thing broke down, right. And so what they didn't know, right, was that an employee was going to do that, right. It really wasn't taken into account, probably, that this is something that could have happened. But the risk itself was known. How it was going to represent itself was the unknown. And and then they start thinking, did we do everything wrong? And it's nope, right. So it really is interesting. And I we talk about this spend now RTP, and we didn't want to focus solely on that. But when you think about all of that, right, there's a lot of known, a lot of unknown, and right now, because nobody's really training on the operational aspects of those systems, there's a lot you don't know what you don't know in that space. So I think it's a timely topic, as you mentioned. We're hoping people carry this conversation right through the membership, because these are the conversations that are really valuable in an organization, especially as you're doing planning, as you're thinking about working with a vendor, contracting with somebody to help you do a strat. These are really good conversations that people
It-
need to dig into.
I have two things I want to add to that conversation. So I know for me, ERM was something Sean talked about for years, and it was a thing. And after this risk retreat, it was really interesting. So the two things are, at the risk retreat, there were groups of people, no names, definitely no names, but they were saying that they weren't really tied to their strategic risk management. And the other part, and I'm going to mention it and come back, the other part in reading the book, and I do walk away with a lot of questions, it seemed that risk is divided into two categories, really broad. One was for the strategic risk management, what keeps the company moving, what's new, what new unknowns, all of that. The other is the stuff that we've known for years. It's the tactical risk management. It's knowing how to underwrite an originator, what the risk is for compliance risk and operational risk and fraud risk. That stuff we've known all the time. But the idea is that risk becomes bigger and institutional wide. How do we make, and I think you mentioned it right in the beginning, how does the organization work as a team in looking at these risks, knowing that you're going to take care of strategic risk, I'm going to take care of operational risk? At what point are you going to hand a strategic risk over to me that is now an operational risk because you did all the work and it's now in a stage where we're just going to monitor, measure, make sure nothing new is happening? Any thoughts on that? Because that's what I really want to pull out of the commenters on this podcast.
Yeah, so this is that whole idea of siloing, right? In some respect, and a lot of the classic example over the last few years of the disconnect, right? How many of our members would joke with us that, hey, not to pick on retail, but retail rolls out this product, they never got any input from the operations folks, and now we're left with these gaps, or we didn't turn on the right settings immediately, or we didn't understand what the controls that were offered meant because it wasn't the right people in the room, right? Mm-hmm. And so we hear that a lot, right? We weren't in the room, or we didn't have the right people in the room. And, when you think about a team, right? So when I coach softball, right, we ask everybody, what is your individual goal for the season, right? And how does my individual goal fit into how we're going to make the team goal, which is obviously have the best record and hopefully win the championship, right? And so that's the same in kids and adults. Everybody goes with their own, hey, here's my career path. Here's what I want to become at the financial institution. But how does that fit into the overall success in the organization? And you have to have those conversations, number one, to figure out, where does that baton get passed, right? What's being passed on, right? So one of the things that sometimes I fear is when people say, oh, we don't have silos here, but then they say, we just don't get all the information we need. Well, okay, that's sort of still a silo, right? The information's still siloed, but they're talking to you. They come into your office and wave, so I guess it's not a silo. But if information is being siloed, right, that's the same as not having the conversations to begin with. And I think, for personal reasons, right, people sometimes hold things, right? They worry that they're not going to get enough credit, or they're not going to get recognized, right? And that is, I'm not knocking that at all, right? That's human nature. But at some point, we have to understand that the greater good, right? It's not going to do anybody any good if you get all this recognition, don't pass the information, and we fail, right? Or product doesn't do what it's supposed to do, or God forbid we have an issue with regulators because of the way we're doing things. Mm-hmm. And all that recognition you got 4 months ago is going to completely evaporate, right? So there's this, there's a need to understand human behavior, but also you have to make sure that the behaviors are towards the common goal, right? And it's that whole, what's our risk appetite versus risk tolerance, right? The organization sets this risk appetite, right? And we need to shear that downstream. But then there's this risk tolerance, which we're willing to accept something to achieve this shorter goal, right? And are we doing that enough, right? Or a lot of times you hear we just get shut down, right? Well, is that because you don't want the risk tolerance, or people don't really understand the risk appetite to begin with, or they wouldn't have brought the idea, right? So communication amongst the teams on a multitude of levels, like you just said, the big picture of it, right? The strategic risk, what's going to keep the business going. Everybody needs to understand that. But then when you bring it down to an operational ERM level, you have to have that. It has to go across the lines, because, again, one department may be getting kudos today, but you get a regulator comes in and says you guys are putting liquidity risk on the institution because of this product. All those high fives are gone, right? It doesn't matter what you did as part of the project. Everybody involved is now going to get the wrath of management, most likely. So work across those lines, understand, there is the need to share. And to the groups that have been left out, right, you also have to contribute, right? There has to be some going back, right? Because that's going to make the folks setting the strategy, they're going to have a lot more information if you are sharing upwards as well. So communication is really important. And there's a lot of benefits. I mean, if you look at the COSO framework, I mean, they list like this, the enormous benefits of just using ERM, right? From a business standpoint, not from a managing risk standpoint, from business standpoint, there's tremendous benefit in a properly functioning ERM process. And, they have their framework, obviously, but when you dig into that, you're like, there's a lot of side benefit of properly doing ERM. And one of that is the cohesion with the groups, right? Obviously, as everybody gets a little more educated. You also get that, in our world, when someone's doing those exams for the retail payments, right? You're not getting different answers from different staff people given to the regulators, which causes a little bit of jitter on their end. So there's a lot good in this. And to me, the negatives of ERM are all really personal, right? They're, hey, I don't get to get all the credit, or I have to deal with somebody maybe that I don't get along with, or I don't like how they run their department because this is the way you should manage people. Those are all personal drawbacks to ERM. So if you were to say to somebody, list the personal drawbacks to you of function in ERM, they could probably list several, right? But if you were to say organizationally, how are we negatively impacted by a strong ERM program, you're not going to come up with one, right? And so right there is, tells you a lot about, looking from an organization standpoint. It's not about, at that point, it's no longer about the individual, it's about the organization. And in a team construct, everybody has individual goals, but they have to be feeding the ultimate goal of the organization.
Sean, let me interrupt you. You're talking around my last topic, so let me get the question out. And first, I'd like to congratulate Sean as a newly minted, accredited payment risk professional, APRP. Congratulations, right? You can announce that, or did we?
Yeah, no, I got the pass on the computer screen. I would imagine there's a more formal notice coming from NACHA, but it's a very tough exam. 2 hours, which for me in exams is a long time. I was really impressed with the exam, actually.
Yeah, well, congratulations. And with that, the title of this session is Risk Management and Payments. And we like to tie this back to the new role of operations. So when we smash those together, what are the skill sets? Maybe a member comes from an environment where they were the ACH coordinator, the ATM person, the wire person, and now it's expanded to teams of people working on different pieces of that. What are the skills that you think employees need today to really excel at good risk management and payments?
Yeah, so I think one skill is interpersonal relations, communication, right? It's really important, right? And again, it's something that can be learned, right? You can become a good communicator. You can learn, there's all kinds of tests, the DISC and all of that you can use to help learn how to better communicate with the folks you're working for and the folks you're working with. I think another area that helps in risk management is to have an imagination. And I think in operations, sometimes the amount of things operations people see just from their everyday experience, they're dealing with the branches, the stories they get to hear, and we get to hear some of them, which are tremendous. But I think there's in that, right? Ops people, I think, need to be able to envision not, oh, the building's going to blow up and, but that thing of, hey, well, what happens if somebody shares their account with their boyfriend? Or, hey, I was at another institution, we had a similar customer base, and, this happened in those industries during the pandemic, right? Do we want to think about that for how we're approaching X, Y, or Z? So I think for operations people to be able to really be key contributors to good risk management, they have to be able to communicate. They have to be strong, right? Make sure that their voice gets heard, because again, they have so much in here. I'm always amazed when I talk with our ops people. They remember all the stories. They can tell you exactly which members are the biggest problems or which customers are always doing. They have that, really good institutional knowledge, but they also then can use that to think about, again, not the easy things are like contingency planning. What happens if there's a cyber threat? I mean, all of that, I'm not saying it's easy, but everybody pretty much understands the major threats. I think ops people have the ability through their experience to use imagination to say, if we roll something out this way, right? Or if we don't turn on this control with the vendor, or if we choose this vendor over this vendor, I can see these one or two things consistently happening based upon previous experience with our customers. And I think that must be gold for management to make proper decisions, right? And so I think two skills right off the bat I would look for would be somebody that can communicate well and somebody that has imagination, right? And that might not be the right word I'm using, because I don't think you can say, hey, how good is your imagination in an interview? But the ability to take your experience and your knowledge, both of people and process, to say, here are some things we absolutely have to consider. But, to me, those are two things that jump right out.
Well, that's about it for the questions, but let me ask you one more curveball question, because I've been on the receiving end of that really qualified ops person. That we've known them for years. We know they do a good job. They know they run a medium size or large operation. When you get the call that they say, I guess we're implementing X this week. This is the first time hearing of it. What advice or what skill would help them not to be in that situation? And clearly a lot of it is not in their control. Yeah. So, is it the interpersonal? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's just somebody that would have good relationships across the bank is probably not going to get bank or credit union is probably not going to get blindsided. The other thing could be just somebody that's always asking questions. Hey, what's going on with the IT people? Or somebody that's a little bit inquisitive to say, hey, I know we've seen a couple of reps from COCC and anything that I should know about, So I think there's a couple of different ways to do that. And again, without being that, oh, I'm the ops person, you need to tell, pumping chest. I think there's ways to, again, I've always said this, and I've had a couple of mentors that do this, try to make everybody else feel important, and they'll tell you stuff, right? And I think if you do that, whether it's with their internal audit or with regulators or even with other departments of the institution, you're probably going to get a farther than if you have that chest pumping, you can't do that without talking to me first. Like, no, they can, they just did. And now you're left to deal with it, right? And so, and I also think once that happens, you need to have somebody that's confident enough to go to management and say, here's why this is really bad for the organization. My team, who knows our customers and knows these rules and regulations, if we could have just got a little more heads up, we could have maybe turned on some more controls or been able to better explain it to the salespeople from a payment standpoint to get better. Because sometimes those things are rolled out with very little success from a adoption standpoint. And some of that is just because of the way it was rolled out. It has nothing to do with the product, or you just get the right people talking to the people responsible for selling it or pushing it. So I think there's a little aftermath you can do using interpersonal skills, but beforehand, it's that inquisitive person that's talking with everybody and generally cares what's going on with everybody's department. You're probably going to get a lot further.
Excellent. I think that was a good bonus. That's it for this episode. I want to remind you, this is just the beginning of the conversation. If you had some thoughts on this topic, if you think that ERM doesn't work, if you think that it works best in this environment, if you think, communication is the key, love to hear your thoughts. I think our audience would like to hear your thoughts as well. Please share on LinkedIn, the podcast. We have a members corner. We do intend to attack some of these thoughts and concepts and learning in our Neach University next year. So stay tuned for that. And if you have any comments or feedback directly for us, send that email to wrestlingpayments.com. Thanks again for joining us, Sean. You're always a hit on this show. You're such a natural. I'm glad you didn't go into TV and you came here instead. And thanks for listening, everyone.
On behalf of Neach, your trusted resource in payments, and our guests, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning into the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to hear more about payments innovation and modernization, you can find the Wrestling Payments Podcast on the podcast page of Neach.org or wherever you subscribe to podcasts. Just search for Wrestling Payments in your podcast app. Thanks for listening.